because we have excellent panelists. Our first speaker is Souza, who is a Ph.D. and is CEO of Clean Waters Consulting. Dr. Souza was also a founding partner of Princeton Hydro, where he directed all of the aquatic ecology and water resources project and prepared management and guidance plans for over 300 lakes, ponds, rivers, estuaries, and reservoirs located from Florida to Massachusetts. And he has a great presentation for you. And again, hold your questions, write them on the card. We're going to have each speaker go and then come back for questions, and we'll address those. So Dr. Souza, make sure you talk loudly into this, because I was in the back and it was a little tough to hear. So if it sounds booming, it's probably working. Can you guys hear me in the back okay? Escort him out. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're going to talk about harmful algae blooms tonight, and just so there's no confusion, as Ed pointed out, I did retire from Princeton Hydro at the beginning of this year. Clean Waters Consulting is just sort of like a legal way that I can continue to work for Princeton Hydro as part of my retirement. So we're going to get rolling. I really want to first start off by thanking our sponsors, the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, ANJAC, full transparency, I am on the board of trustees of ANJAC, the League of Conservation Voters, and the Lake Mohawk Preservation Foundation and the Lake Mohawk Country Club. This lake has a very, very special part of my heart. I started a lot of my work on this lake, and so it's always been a pleasure to come up here and work on, not only work on the lake, but visit the lake and see Ernie Hofer, and now Jack Parker and John Stanley and the crew that works tirelessly behind the scenes, John Notero and his folks. But this is a special place for me. So let's get rolling. Harmful algae blooms, or harmful algal blooms, however you want to define them, unfortunately, this has become something that we've become more and more aware of, particularly this year, maybe because some of the conditions that we've had with a very wet spring and extraordinarily wet July, and conditions that promote these types of algae blooms. What I'm going to talk about is really what are they, get in a little bit of the science, why did they occur, and then what can we do to manage or prevent these from occurring. So first off, what's a HAB? Well, harmful algae blooms, let me start off by saying this is nothing new, okay? It is perhaps a little bit new to the public and the policymakers. I'm going to date myself. I started working on lakes and reservoirs in 1975 as a master's student at Rutgers, and one of the first things I was doing was studying a blue-green algae bloom, because that's what they were called then, not cyanobacteria blooms, at Spruce Run Reservoir. And that's been my career, trying to figure out why these things occur, how to manage them, and how to prevent them. So they are caused by cyanobacteria, and when we say we have a harmful algae bloom, I'm going to step over here so I can see this screen a little bit better. When we say we have a harmful algae bloom, it's because we have an intense growth of cyanobacteria. And when those blooms become very intense and the densities of those organisms become very high, they release Cyano Toxins into the water column. And that's what we're concerned about on a human health standpoint, is the Cyano Toxins. But HABs also impact the water quality of lakes. They impact the ecology of those lake ecosystems. So they have a detrimental impact on lake ecosystems, so, as well as how we can recreate in those water bodies and safely drink water from reservoirs. At very high concentrations, I know all of you are aware of this, you've read this in the newspapers, that cyanotoxins can create health issues for humans as well as pets and livestock. And we'll get into a little bit of all of that. So I'm going to get into the science, so just bear with me a little bit. But first off, cyanobacteria, although we call them algae, they're very much different than algae. They're prokaryotes. So if you look at the cell structure of cyanobacteria, they're very simplistic. There's no organelles, but they do share one thing with phytoplankton, or what I'm going to probably refer to over the evening as the good algae. And that's that they can photosynthesize. And so that's a property that cyanobacteria share with algae. What makes them so unique? Well, I mean, these organisms have been around since probably the beginning of time. They are essentially the building blocks for a lot of the life on Earth. They can assimilate atmospheric nitrogen. So that gives them, some of them, an unlimited source of nitrogen. They can pull that right out of the atmosphere. It takes a lot of energy, but they can do that. That's something that other algae cannot do. Biologically, they're very adept at assimilating and utilizing organic phosphorus. What's the big deal about that? I'll come back and show you what the big deal is about it. But again, good algae can't do that. Can't do it as effectively as cyanobacteria. The interesting thing with them is that they can regulate where they are in the water column. So a lot of them have gas vacuoles, so on a bright sunny day like today, rather than get scorched by all the UV, they can lower themselves into the water column and avoid those impacts. But on a cloudy day, rise themselves up so they can maximize the amount of sunlight that's available to them. They can also lower themselves down into the water column to get to where there's a lot of nutrients and utilize those nutrients. So unlike the good algae that are really, they're destined to sink and settle out, cyanobacteria can rise and fall and regulate where they are in the water column and use that as a means of actually outcompeting the good algae. A lot of them do very well in very low light conditions. So there's certain species that can drop way down into the water column where a lot of nutrients will tend to accumulate right at the thermocline, that thermal break that divides the warm water from the cold water, and utilize all the nutrients that are there, exclusive to them and something that can't be done by the good algae. An interesting thing is that a lot of them are selectively rejected by filter feeders. So mussels, zooplankton, will actually spit them out. And there's some cool little videos showing them being selectively rejected. So these filter feeders will feed on and utilize all the good algae, but selectively reject the cyanobacteria. Again, it gives them a competitive advantage. And the main thing that we're concerned about is that they produce cyano toxins. Now, keep in mind that cyanobacteria did not evolve producing cyanotoxins to harm humans. This is a means by which they can outcompete other algae. And you see a lot of plants that do this. Desert plants produce chemicals that keep their competitors away from them, so they can utilize nutrients in soils and water that are exclusive to them. And cyanobacteria use cyanotoxins to do just that. So that gives them a really big competitive advantage over the good algae. Now, some of those cyanotoxins may ooze out very slowly day to day, from the cells, but where it becomes a really big problem is when the cells, you have a large die-off of these organisms, the cells lyse, they burst, and they release a large amount of cyanotoxins into the water column. And I'll get back to why that is an important consideration. Once those compounds are in the water column, they're very stable. It takes a long time for them to biodegrade. So you can get a lot of these products in the water column very rapidly, and they stay in the water column for a very long period of time. So I'm going to take off just a little bit of a tangent. And this is why I mentioned things about organic phosphorus and cyanotoxin release on a large scale. A lot of you are familiar with copper sulphate treatments, okay? And that is sort of the knee-jerk reaction to any type of algae bloom. Treat it with copper, bomb it with copper. That can actually have major negative effects on water quality and our ability to properly manage cyanobacteria. It can be part of your toolbox in managing your lake, but it should not be your go-to tool, okay? And the reason for that is that every time you treat a lake with copper sulfate, that copper blows up the algal cells. Good algae in cyanobacteria. So what ends up happening is you release a whole bunch of cyanotoxins very quickly, all at once, large amounts. And in addition to that, you release a lot of organic phosphorus. So now you've created an environment that is that much more hospitable to more cyanobacteria growth. So yes, you get some temporary relief, but what you'll see is that typically those blooms come back more quickly, and they come back more intensely. So be careful with copper sulfate. Those of you that have worked with me in the past or have taken my class at Rutgers, you know this is something that I preach heavily. Do not rely on copper sulfate. So that's my little tangent. Here's the bad guys that we're talking about when we talk about cyanobacteria. Microcystis, Planktothrix, which used to be called Oscillatoria, Anabena, which is now called something else. It's a tongue twister. I haven't really gotten that one down yet. Aphanizomenon, Anacapsa, Lingvia, and Gliotrichia. The last two are pretty unique because they're benthic. They grow on the bottom. But these are the bad guys, and they're the ones that cause all of these types of problems, these funky paint spill-like types of conditions on the surface of the lake. And yes, when you see a condition like this, or this, or this is because you've got a major bloom, and typically the bloom is starting to break down, either because it's been treated or it's reached its lifespan. Cyanotoxins, here's the ones, we talk a lot about cyanotoxins. In freshwater ecosystems, these are the three that are most commonly discussed. Microcystin, Cylindrospermopsin, Anotoxin, and to some extent saxitoxins. Lingvia produces saxitoxins. But those are the toxins that we're most concerned about in a freshwater ecosystem. Cyanotoxins, yes, we come into contact with it both dermally, by recreating in waters that have high concentrations of cyanotoxins, or by drinking that water. The same thing holds true for pets and for livestock. And even at low concentrations, you can end up with negative effects. That could be in the form of an ear or throat infection, maybe a skin rash. The problem is at the very higher concentrations, these toxins are neurotoxins and they're hepatotoxins. They affect the central nervous system and they affect the liver. And there's some research that it's actually showing that long-standing exposure, drinking a lot of this water, maybe inadvertently, that has these cyanotoxins, may be linked to various neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's and even Alzheimer's. That's some research that's happening now. Okay, so that's what cyanobacteria are all about. That's what cyanotoxins are all about. Why do they occur? Well, like I said, this is nothing new. What we can do is we can thank the city of Toledo for bringing this to everybody's attention. So how many of you are familiar with back in 2013 that the city of Toledo, their entire water system had to be shut down and they had to go to bottled water? How many familiar with that? Okay, fair number of you. And that was a result of a massive algae bloom in Lake Erie, and the intake to the Toledo water plant is from a canal that extends out to Lake Erie. Here's something probably you don't realize. Blooms of that intensity had occurred prior to that, and blooms of that intensity have occurred since then. The water treatment plant wasn't ready, though, at that time to deal with that intensive a bloom. So again, these are not an uncommon occurrence, but because of what happened in Toledo, this sort of projected and magnified the problems associated with cyanobacteria. The common denominators, this is typically what sets up a HAB. We have an excessive amount of nutrient loading. And this is in particular phosphorus. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about phosphorus. And runoff is the major source of the majority of that loading. So it comes in with stormwater. About 70% of the country's waterways are impaired because of stormwater runoff. So stormwater runoff and managing stormwater is a big deal. Second thing is that if you go out and you look at these lakes that are impaired by a HAB, they have relatively high concentrations of phosphorus in the water column. Third thing is that water temperatures tend to be on the warmer side, although you can have a cyanobacteria bloom in the winter. First time I came here to Lake Mohawk, there was an actual cyanobacteria bloom under the ice. I thought they had dyed the ice green for St. Patrick's Day. It was a non-toxin producing cyanobacteria, but nonetheless it was Celospherium, and it was out there even in the middle of the winter. But typically those bad guys manifest when the water is warm. And then finally, you need a lot of sunlight for photosynthesis. So those last two bullet points, that's what we have in the winter. Warm temperatures, plenty of sunlight. And that what ends up creating a lot of these blooms to occur. How am I doing with time?
You're doing very well.
Okay. A lot to cover. Lake eutrophication. Again, this is a term that limnologists like myself use all the time, and a lot of you are familiar with that term. What that refers to is excessive nutrient loading and an increase in productivity or the production of organic carbon. Okay, that's a lot of science, okay? But it's no different from what happens on a farm field. It's no different what happens on your lawn. And basically what it boils down to is the more nutrients you put into a lake, the more productivity. And typically in lakes, productivity is going to be expressed as phytoplankton. And when that phytoplankton is dominated by cyanobacteria, that becomes a problem, and that's when you have a HAB. So lake eutrophication and the whole process of nutrient loading, excessive nutrient loading, cut to the chase. And phosphorus is the primary driver of eutrophication. In New Jersey, and actually the majority of the lakes and reservoirs in the US, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient or the nutrient of concern. What that means is that the more phosphorus you introduce into a lake ecosystem, the more productivity. So it's just like putting more fertilizer on your lawn, or a farmer that puts more fertilizer on a cornfield. You get more productivity, but in this case, that productivity is expressed as phytoplankton, and then in turn, if it's expressed as cyanobacteria, you've got a problem. The thing is, although you see in lakes that are impacted by HABs, high phosphorus concentrations, it doesn't take that much. We're only talking about 40 parts per billion, 0.04 milligrams per liter. Anybody know what the state standard for phosphorus is in lakes and reservoirs? It's 0.05. So you can be below the state standard, but yet have enough phosphorus to actually stimulate an algae bloom, okay? So it doesn't take much. And this is something that my colleague at Princeton Hydro developed based on a whole bunch of studies that he's conducted, Dr. Fred Lubnow. Probably a lot of you know Fred. He works a lot on Lake Apacon and Greenwood Lake. But 1 pound of phosphorus can generate 1,000 pounds of algae. So again, you don't need a lot of phosphorus to create these problems. A big misnomer is that eutrophic lakes are dead. And what I like to say, and probably some of you have heard me say this numerous times, is that that's not the case. They're not really dead. What they really need to do is go on a diet. They're getting too much phosphorus. And so our focus as lake managers is to try to reduce how much phosphorus is coming into a lake on a daily basis, on an annual basis. The bad news is that the majority of the lakes in New Jersey are already phosphorus rich. There's more than enough phosphorus, so the majority of them are eutrophic. There's very few lakes in New Jersey that are not eutrophic. That makes the majority of the lakes in New Jersey susceptible to HABs. So this is eutrophic Lake A. Not too bad, right? This is a pretty good looking lake. How many of you would be happy to have a lake that looks like this? You should put your hand up. I mean, that's a pretty good looking lake, okay? This is eutrophic Lake B, all right? That's not too good. Nobody wants to see this, all right? But both of those lakes are eutrophic. The difference is how much phosphorus and whether or not that lake is being actively managed. Okay, so again, cutting to the chase, you know where I'm going with this. How to control eutrophication and limit HABs, we need to be talking about phosphorus management. So some of you have heard me say this in the past. This is my mantra when it comes to lake management. You don't just treat the symptoms or react, you just don't treat or react to the symptom. You have to identify and correct the cause. And bear with me, those of you that have taken my lake course at Rutgers, I've used this analogy numerous times. Everybody in here at some point in time has had a fever. That fever could have been just the result of having the flu, could be a result of eating something bad, could be an infection, it could be a serious illness. The fever is a symptom that there's something wrong. The mode of what you do to correct that illness or to address what's making you sick is going to be very much different in each one of those cases. So you can't get fooled by an algae bloom. An algae bloom is an algae bloom, but why is it happening? You have to dig deeper and figure out what is actually causing it. So if you just stop at the symptom and you react by just treating it with copper sulfate, you're not going to be successful in your lake management activities. And just like you wouldn't build a house without a plan, you can't manage a lake without having a plan. And so this lake is actively managed. Why? There's a plan that's been put in place. That plan has been modified over the years, and it utilizes the blueprint by which this lake's water quality is managed and maintained. So you need a technically sound management plan. And that plan, the basis of that plan is going to be identifying what is causing the lake's eutrophication and what is causing the development of a HAB. Lakes are really complex living organisms. There's a lot of things that are going on. There's biological, chemical, hydrologic, physical interactions. All of these things occur. You poke a lake one way, it reacts a certain way. You poke it another way, it reacts another way. If you don't understand all of those interactions, you can't manage your lake successfully. So number one, the plan's goal is going to be collect the right data to allow you to understand all these interactions and how the lake is going to respond to certain types of management activities. And the priority element of all of that is both quantifying and identifying all the sources and quantifying how much phosphorus is associated with each source, and when does that phosphorus hit my lake? Does it come in the spring? Does it come in during the summer? So that is all very, very important. So if phosphorus is the problem, where is it coming from? Well, some of you that are familiar with this Pogo cartoon. The enemy is us. We love our lakes, and what do? We develop the watershed. As we develop the watershed, we end up putting more phosphorus into the water column as a result of land development, as a result of fertilizer use, a whole bunch of different things. And so as a result of that, we end up being our worst enemy. And the important thing with that is that if we're the enemy, then we're the ones that are at the root of the problem, but we're also the ones that are in charge of correcting that problem. So phosphorus inputs, they're variable, and this is why a plan is very important, to figure out where it's all coming from. Is it internal? Lake Mohawk is very unique compared to many of the lakes in the state. This had a very large internal load that needed to be addressed. We won't get into the specifics of that, but believe me, it had a very large internal load. But typically what we find is that the external load is what's driving the process. Stormwater runoff, septic systems, waterfowl. Here's another little tidbit. 4 geese produce as much phosphorus in one day as 1 septic system. Okay, 4 Canada geese equals 1 septic system. So that can be extremely detrimental. Restoration and management plans, comprehensive data-backed plan. It's got to consist of reactive actions, and this would be like the things, for instance, with maybe some selective use of copper sulphate or some other type of algicide. Proactive, preventative approaches where you're throttling down and decreasing the amount of phosphorus that's entering the lake. There's going to be in-lake management measures, like at this lake, where there's aeration that's used. There's a very sophisticated alum injection system, and then watershed management measures. Again, Mohawk has invested a considerable amount of time and money and effort doing stormwater management improvements around the entire watershed. And they're working on improving that as well. For the majority of the lakes that I've studied, about 80% of them, the problem is with the watershed, what's happening external to the lake. And so the foundation of the plan is got to be figuring out where all of this phosphorus is coming from and focusing your management efforts on stormwater. I'm a past president of the North American Lake Management Society. How many of you are familiar with NOMS? I hope at least some of you are. Okay, NOMS is a great vehicle by which scientists get together with lake users and lake property owners and exchange information. This year's conference is up in Burlington, Vermont in November. Take the time to go up there. It's not that bad a drive, and you'll learn a lot. really. So it's not a whole bunch of eggheads getting together talking about HABs. It's mostly lake community residents that get together and get educated. Same thing with New Jersey Cola. New Jersey Cola is a terrific opportunity to meet other lake community members and learn about what's happening about lakes, about lake management, and other issues that affect lakes. So how many of you are familiar with New Jersey Cola? Good, that's a good number. And I have nothing but praise for New Jersey Cola because they're doing a great job. But that whole idea, a lake is a reflection of its watershed. When you look out from a lake and you see a lot of development, when you see stormwater pipes that are discharging unregulated or uncontrolled, if you see lawns that are extending right to the water's edge, those are all problems that are resulting in the eutrophication or adding to the eutrophication problem and causing HABs in some situations. So stormwater is important, and this is why we need to manage it. It directly affects the amount and timing of phosphorus loading. It indirectly affects mixing. Every time you have a storm event, that causes the lake to turn over. In some cases, that may upwell nutrients from the bottom or cells from the bottom back up to the surface. It's a source of legacy loading. All that sediment that comes in and the phosphorus that's bound to that sediment settles to the bottom. Weeds grow from that. Mad algae grows from that. And that becomes an internal source of phosphorus loading. And it indirectly even affects septics. When you have a very wet year like this year, the groundwater elevation stays high, and as a result, even in the summer, you may end up with phosphorus that's seeping out into the lake from septics. So successful lake management and HAB management has to involve systemic stormwater management with the emphasis placed on phosphorus load reduction. Next two speakers are going to talk exclusively about stormwater management. What can be done at the residential level, what can be done on a more regional level. And there's a lot of things that we can do both individually and then collectively as a community to manage stormwater runoff. So in summary, HABs are not a new thing, okay? Yes, the frequency and the severity of HABs is increasing. Doesn't take too much. In terms of a little bit warmer water temperatures, we don't see our lakes freeze over as frequently or as solid as they used to in the past. A little bit warmer water temperatures give everything that a jump start to get growing. We know that storm events are more intense and they happen more frequently. And with that comes more runoff. That results in high densities of phytoplankton and unfortunately a lot of times cyanobacteria. And when those cyanobacteria densities get very high, then as a result of that, we have a HAB, and we have toxins that are released into the water column that affect us, our pets, livestock. Unfortunately, New Jersey lakes are going to be susceptible to HABs. They need to be managed. They need to be actively managed. And I'll leave this with you as a takeaway again. Copper sulfate may be part of your management plan, your toolbox, but don't rely on it. What you have to rely on is mechanisms that remove and keep phosphorus away from phytoplankton and away from the cyanobacteria. So our goal is to do away with signs like this and have our lakes swimmable, fishable, and enjoyable year-round. Julia, are you going to be making this available to the public in any way? Because I've got a whole bunch of different links that you can go to. DEP, the North American Lake Management Society, and New York State DEC have put out some very good information. I've provided you with some of those links, as well as links that pertaining to HABs and HAB management that are available through EPA and other sources. Those of you that have pets, and I have a dog that, although it's a husky, she doesn't like to swim that much, but she does go in the water. This last one at the bottom was written by a veterinarian for the state of Minnesota, and is specific about the risks of harmful algal blooms on pets. So if those of you that are interested, that's a pretty good one too. So with that, I say thank you, and I'll pass it on to Ed.
Thank you, Dr. Souza.